Okay, we'll get going. Well, I'm quite surprised first to see this many people here because this is a session where I'm kind of assuming you're all working with FIM already. Is that fair enough? Yes? Good, I am seeing some nodding. Excellent. Okay. Now, the first thing I realized when I started, I'd already put in my synopsis, and then I started trying to, work out the slides for this topic, is that I'd bitten off far more than I could chew. There's a lot to FIM, as everyone knows who works with it. There's a lot of different configurations, a lot of different environments, and I really cannot cover every single case and best practice. So I've decided to focus on things I do in every project. And along the way, if we pass by some new R2 features, I'm going to point them out. This is not an R2 update session, and you can go and read all the fine documentation about all the R2 new features, but I will point out any new ones as we go. So I'm going to be focusing on server architecture, sync service, portal, and we will get to self-service password reset. I've got a few slides on that at the end. So let's start with server architecture. So this is sort of your basic server architecture. I think this is a reasonable sort of architecture for a lot of the sort of size environments that I see in this part of the world. So with the sync and FIM service databases, can be off on a SQL server, perhaps a cluster. We used to say with MIS, put them together with the sync service. This is now not so much the case with virtual servers and all our gigabit backbones and VLANs and all that sort of thing. So it is fine to move those databases off to another SQL server. I often find as well having them on a SQL server where they're actually being properly managed is an advantage. So where the SQL team is actually looking after the backups and the indexing and all that sort of good stuff. The sync service, the service and portal, the password reset, you can of course co-locate these all on one server. I think it really depends on how many people you have accessing them, and things like with password reset portal, if you have external users accessing that, I would definitely say put it on its own server. As usual, the SQL spec is our most important factor in terms of performance. That hasn't changed at all. And just a couple of things about redundancy. Again, not a lot of change here. The only part of the FIM environment that we can actually properly cluster is SQL. And even then, FIM does not now and has never supported full functionality with an automatic failover. So if your DBs fail over, there may still be some restarts and things like that that you have to do on the FIM side. All the portal elements, we can use load balancing. The sync service, our only option as yet is a standby server, either pointing at the same database or pointing at a recent copy of the sync service database. Of course, people are often using virtual machines now anyway for these sorts of things. And we do also have the option of service partitioning of the FIM service. So this is this idea where that engine operating underneath the portal that's processing requests and running the workflows, you can actually have that installed on multiple machines should you need to for load. There's a whole new architectural component you may need to think about with R2. The reporting module with R2 is designed to run on top of System Center Data Warehouse. And System Center Data Warehouse has all its own architectural requirements. It's got its own databases. It's got these two servers, the System Center Service Manager and the System Center Data Warehouse, which must be on separate servers. There's also some I would be careful, if I were you, if you're thinking of installing System Center Data Warehouse just for FIM reporting, because you're going to go for a minimalistic installation. You're going to try and get away with, as few servers as you can. If you plan to extend this environment out later to other System Center reporting, Active Directory reporting, all the things you're supposed to do with the System Center Data Warehouse, my understanding is you may have some issues. There are certain architectural decisions you need to make early on. Do you go with SQL Enterprise, SQL Standard? How many servers do you have? This sort of thing. So think about it carefully if you're just planning on it for FIM reporting. There might be other things you can do instead, which I can talk to you about later if you want to discuss it. I just wanted to point out some of you might have come across the FIM book, Volume 1 by David Lundell. His R2 version came out yesterday. I've actually been hassling him about this. I said, I want to tell people this book is out at TechEd New Zealand, so make sure it's ready. So just for you guys, the book is indeed out. So he's got the full discussion of all the different architectural decisions you can make, and he's added a fantastic chapter on Kerberos, understanding all that tricky Kerberos SPN stuff, which he's explained with some whole fairground motif thing, so it should make it easy to follow. I understood it after I read it anyway, so it must be easy. Okay, there is a best practices analyzer now for FIM 2010 R2. It just really tells you that the SQL agents are running, the SQL tasks. It's not going to tell you a thing about your FIM configuration. So, it's a start, but I would say of limited use yet. So just on performance, like I said before, SQL performance is the most important thing. You should be re-indexing your FIM databases. This is something you have to arrange to do. If you haven't come across this guy's website before, Ola Hallengren, he's a SQL MVP. He's got some fantastic scripts which will check how much indexing is needed and just do the right amount and that sort of thing. The other thing with FIM sync is the transaction logs. So who's run into the whole transaction log blowout problem on their FIM sync database? No? Yes? A couple of people? It certainly used to be a big problem with more limited disk space, but you do need to keep those transaction logs under control. There's a lot of forward and back going on in the database, and every single little change adds to your transaction log. So one of the things you should do is keep your run history to a minimum. Myself, I never keep more than a week. Some people have years worth of run history. It's crazy. There's not a lot of helpful information in run history because it only shows you the current state of the objects. It doesn't show you the state when they were exported or synced. So it's useful to see when jobs ran, but you know, more than a week, don't worry about it. Regular database and log backups, obviously, and if you know you're doing a big import of a new connector space, then switch the databases into simple recovery mode while you're doing that, and you won't get the transaction log blowout. So performance on the sync service. Now this, of course, is a complex topic because a lot of it is down to configuration. Indexing attributes that you will have all seen when you join with a non-index attribute. It pops up and tells you to go index it. Index the attributes. There's no harm in doing it, and it certainly does make any kind of metaverse searching on those attributes a lot quicker. But the biggest thing that impacts sync service performance is people trying to get the sync service to do too much. Really, the sync service is great at maintaining connections between objects and synchronizing data between them. That's what it's good at. It's not so great at constructing data with complex rules and having to do lots of find MV entries and all this sort of thing. It's slow. Now, what's really good at crunching data is SQL. So one thing I've been doing for years now is this notion of putting a presentation layer between your data sources and FIM sync. And that presentation layer will be based on SQL, and you can have your SSIS packages or whatever you've got. You do your data gathering, pump it through a SQL table, get those reference attributes ready, correctly formatted. An example is many HR databases have an employee table, and then they'll have a position table. And to find the manager attribute, you have to extrapolate it from the position table. Now you can import the employee table and import the position table and try and do a whole lot of mucking around with find MV entries to figure out who the manager is. And if your data quantity is small, you'll get away with that. Once you start getting into large data sets, that will seriously impact your performance. So you use that SQL table, let it work out who the manager is, or your scripts in there. Generate a delta table while you're at it. We love delta syncs. So portal performance. There is one great improvement in R2, and that's on the FIM-MA. So who experienced exporting a whole bunch of users to the FIM portal for the first time? Yeah, and did you have to wait a while? 8 hours, yeah. There's been people who've literally had to wait days. And it was because every single object exported through the FIM-MA in creates was being dealt with individually before the next export. So it'd take the create and then, right, what sets does this belong to? Do we have any workflows? Right, okay, now I'm ready for the next one. When you did updates, it batched them. But creates, for some reason, they were individual. So now we do have batched exports on by default through the FIM-MA. And it'll basically take a whole pile at once and then sort out all the set and workflow stuff after they're in the portal. There is a comment in the release notes that if you have validation errors somewhere in that batch, it can mess up the whole batch. So if you think there's a high probability that you'll have objects which are either missing required attributes or are not going to meet those validation strings, then you can go into the config file and change. There's a setting you can change so that the batches will be smaller. The other thing, service partitioning, I've already mentioned. So this idea where we can have the FIM service running on a few different servers. There is a change in R2 where the FIM-MA will now automatically use any service. And so if you have the kind of architecture where you've set up a FIM service specifically for the sync service to use to keep that separate from your user FIM service, then again, there's a config file change you need to make. Just a sec. So the other thing that severely impacts portal performance is sets. Every time you change an object in the portal, it goes through every single set, seeing if that object is now a member of that set. And this is even for sets that don't even have that type of object in them. So once you start getting into hundreds and hundreds of sets, you do start to see performance degrade. And particularly in the case of union sets and not sets. So by union sets, I mean resource ID in active employee and they've got an AD account, makes active AD account. Now, I'm not saying don't use union sets and not sets because I think they're great. I'm a big believer in define each rule once only. So if I have a rule for what makes an active employee, then I want to define that in one place, and any other set that needs active employee to be part of its rule, I want to say resource ID in that set. So I'm not saying don't use them, I'm just saying be aware. If your design has lots of sets, then you may need to be thinking about your SQL performance and perhaps about service partitioning. Okay? So let's have a look at the sync service. So a lot of the things I'm going to say here are not new at all. These are best practices that go back to MIS 2003. But, you know, I still go into sites where people have set things up completely breaking what I thought were well-known best practices. So I'm going to put them in here. So the first thing is don't go creating new object types for things that are basically the same type. So if they're a person, they should be a person in the metaverse. They shouldn't be a contractor, student, employee, separate object type. And the basic rule is if it is ever possible for an identity to transition between one type and another, then they should be the same basic type. People get into all sorts of trouble when their employee becomes a contractor and they were different metaverse object types. So keep them the same, use the one object type, and then use your attributes to classify them. Represent each individual once in the metaverse. So again, I think we should all know this, yes? And yet I see terrible examples. So I don't think I need to go into that. I'll just tell you that. Now, this quote here, this is, I did my training back in MIS with this guy, and I love this thing he said, your metaverse should be a shrine to good data. There's all that rubbish out there in the connected systems. Let's just import the good stuff, right? And if you need to do any cleaning up of the formatting, do it on the way in. I'm not saying don't have advanced flow rules, obviously, but as a general best practice kind of philosophy, I think that's a good one. Okay, classic versus declarative. I'm not going to go through all of this. And I will say right at the outset, I'm still very much in the classic camp. Are the people here using declarative sync rules? Can I see? No one using declarative sync? Okay, I'm among friends. Yeah, look, there is an improvement. So you see my little new badge there. There's an improvement with declarative sync in R2, so I might give it another go. Scoped outbound flow rules. So if you had a play with declarative, the inbound rules were much easier than the outbound. The inbound ones, you just had to tick the box, say, I want to import these people, put them in the FIM portal, and away it all went. For outbound, you had to do all this mucking around with a workflow and an MPR and attaching an ERE, and it was just a pain in the neck. So anyway, they now have scoped outbound rules, so it's much easier. You can just say it's an active person, so give them an AD account, and that'll happen. And it doesn't generate those ERE objects, which is another benefit as well. Unfortunately, the scoped outbound rules cannot be used for deletion. You could use them to disable, but not to actually delete. You still have to do the silly add and then remove the other type of declarative sync rule. So, you know, which one should you use? Well, both will work together. Declarative is improved in R2, but it's still not possible to do everything with declarative, which I must admit kind of puts me off a bit. I will say though, there is one thing you can do with declarative you can't do with classic, and that's selective flow of reference attributes. So I don't know if anyone's tried to create an advanced flow rule on a reference attribute and it just says, nah, not allowing it. And sometimes all you want to do is say whether you're going to flow it or not. It's not like you're trying to change it. You just want to say flow yes or no. You can't do that with classic. Annoys me no end. But with declarative, you can make a sync rule and then make that object in the scope of that sync rule. So, you know, an example is when you're transitioning from unmanaged to managed groups and you want to tick a box in the portal and say this group is now managed in the portal. And from that point, we want to flow the member attribute out to AD. But on the whole, you know, if you are going to do a mix of classic and declarative, then I think you need to be very clear about where you're using each type. Do you just use declarative for certain management agents where it meets all your requirements? My colleague Bob has this idea of using classic for all your inbound rules and declarative for all your outbound rules. I haven't tried that myself, but it could work. So, deprovisioning. Again, I think these are things everyone should know, but I'm going to say them anyway. Don't make decisions on an absence of data. Do you all know this? So what I mean is when HR give you a list of active employees, and when someone falls off the list, you are supposed to assume they've left and go off and disable all their accounts. Have you accidentally disabled accounts? Or not admitting to it? I did. Very first MIS installation. We'll give you the active people. When they go, that means they're gone, right? And a SQL replication error truncated the list. And when we picked it up, we'd already disabled 500 accounts. And this was Exchange 2003 in this Active Directory. Got the accounts re-enabled straight away, and then we had to wait hours for Exchange to re-enable them. So a little bit scarred by that. Always make sure that you're making any decisions on hard data. We don't make decisions on disappearance. That is no data. So you need those employees after they've left with that end date. Following on from that, always plan for bad data entry or, you know, some accident that truncated your list. And so allow changes to be easily reversed. Someone's contract got extended, they didn't remember to put the new end date in HR, so their accounts got disabled. When this is picked up, someone should just put in the new date, sync rules run, everything is back how it was before. So sometimes customers say to me, well, our procedure is we disable the account and we delete the mailbox and we remove all their groups. And I say, no, maybe I'll do it in a month. But right off, all I'm doing is disabling the account. That's it. We need a grace period before we do anything destructive. Okay? Right, let's go have a look at the lab. So, see if I can remember everything I was going to talk about. Let's start on that one. So again, the first thing I'm going to tell you is something that is not new, and that is always have join rules. So this here is a projection source. I'm projecting objects from this source. So they're already joined. Same with a provisioning target. You provision the object, it's already joined. So why do I need join rules? Anyone want to tell me why I need join rules? In case the object gets disconnected, but in case I need to clear and re-import the connector space. And this is one thing I want you to think about. Always, always, always plan to be able to clear and re-import a connector space. Right? That should just be a basic thing that you allow. And so we always must have join rules. And when it's a projection source, you have to think a little more. You have to, if this is an attribute that this connector, this management agent is contributing to the metaverse, well, let me go here. Has everyone seen this? Do not recall attributes. Can everyone read this, by the way? Do I need to zoom? No, we're okay? It's a small room, isn't it? So there's this tick box here. Do not recall attributes contributed by objects from this management agent when disconnected. The default behavior is that when an object is disconnected in the connector space, any attributes it contributed to the metaverse object are removed. If that attribute also has a flow from somewhere else, then that becomes the new, and this is precedent, that becomes the new contributing source, right? So if your join back rule is on something that this management agent contributed and that you haven't exported out from somewhere else, then when you clear the connector space, you're going to delete all those metaverse attributes and you won't be able to do that join back. So you just need to think ahead about these things. Now, I personally don't like ticking that box. I might do it just under that situation where I'm clearing and then re-importing a connector space and I want to make sure I can join back. Even then, I wouldn't be 100% on it. Why? It's because I want to be able to look at the metaverse object, just the metaverse object, and see straight away what it's connected to. Now, if you're doing classic sync rules, you do the count connectors method in the code. Declarative sync does not work like that. Declarative sync only looks at the metaverse object. So if, for example, you have a management agent where you provision only after the AD account was created, how do you know the AD account's been created? Well, in classic, you can count connectors. In declarative, you just look at the metaverse object and you say, oh, look, I flowed back the DN from AD, therefore I know they have an AD account. Now I can go and provision this other one. And the other thing is just reporting. Who's been in and looked at the MMS metaverse table? Don't be scared. I know Microsoft do this. Do not touch the database. Don't you dare. Honestly, it's fine. Just don't update the database. It's okay to look at the database. And the MMS metaverse table is very, very simply laid out with all your metaverse attributes in nice, easy columns. And it's a very simple way to do some reporting. How many people have I got in AD and not this other application? And if you've made sure that you've imported something from that connector space and then you don't have that ticked, so you can rely on the data on that metaverse object, then it's a lot simpler for you. Okay? So I just wanted to show you a little new thing, which actually you don't need R2 for. You can get it if you install update rollup 2. This is only available on the ADMA. It's a new type of connector filter called a import filter. And what this does is you've got your connector filter. It actually doesn't import the object into the connector space in the first place. So a regular connector filter, all the objects come into the connector space and then it blocks them going onto the metaverse. With the import filter, we don't bring them into the connector space in the first place. So I think that's really neat. Just for the ADMA though. Right, the next thing I want to show you in here, who has a environment where they've got the FIM portal? Has anyone here actually got FIM? I know you guys do. Okay, look, when you have the FIM portal, you also have to have the FIM MA, right? And with the FIM MA, you quickly find that you can't do advanced flow rules. And the reason is apparently that our metaverse is supposed to be exactly the same as the portal, which it actually isn't anyway, because we have to go and make these flow rules to get things flowing between the metaverse and the portal anyway. Now, this is frustrating for a couple of reasons. Sometimes you genuinely do have a good reason for wanting an advanced flow rule, but the biggest reason is precedence. You cannot do manual precedence without advanced flow rules on every single import flow rule to that metaverse attribute. Now, imagine the case where our employees are coming from HR, but we're creating contractors in the FIM portal. And so we're going to have things like name and job title, which are either coming from HR or they're coming from the FIM portal. In some cases, we may want to apply precedence. Perhaps we have a student roster as well, and it's possible for someone to be a student and a contractor. You know, so we do need manual precedence, and just with the FIM MA, you don't have it. So I have a little present for you. If you're not using the FIM MA straight away, this isn't going to mean much to you, but remember it for later. The replay MA. We came up with this idea at Unify. This is using completely supported out-of-the-box functionality. What we do is, and I'm in the wrong thing there, with the FIM MA, configure run profiles. Every time we do any kind of import, we drop a log file. Okay? And there's my Delta one. Now, we did originally try just using an XML MA. Unfortunately, it didn't work. So what we do have to do is convert that into LDIF. So we have a PowerShell script and a style sheet. We take that XML drop file and we convert it into LDIF. And then we use a regular out-of-the-box LDIF management agent. And guess what? We have a copy of the FIM MA connector space, which I can't see right now. Okay, it's not going to show it to me, but it's there, I promise. I think I'm just seeing an old connector space. Oh no, I've deleted the history, that's what it is. Anyway, doesn't matter. What I can do then is, well, firstly, I just join. The join rules for any object are the same. I just join on the object ID. It's exactly the same as in the FIM MA. And then I can go and create an advanced flow rule should I want to. And this one very simply just says if they've defined a preferred first name in the portal, then take that instead of the first name. And then this makes all my provisioning and export much simpler. All I have in the metaverse is the first name that they actually want to use. I don't have to keep constantly checking, did they submit a preferred first name, use that instead of the first name. All I want in the metaverse is one name. And I've got that. But in the portal, I still want to have two. I want people to be able to go and manage their own preferred first name. So this is enormously useful. I now use this in every installation where I have the FIM portal. So if you go down that track, remember this, the scripts and the style sheet are available. If you search for the FIM team is basically all the FIM people who work at Unify. And we have a community site where we put our scripts that are available for free download. Okay, I think that's all I was going to say about the sync service right now. Right, portal. There's not many people using the portal, I gather. Oh well. Hope this makes sense. The rules about schema object types are the same as for the metaverse. Don't go creating extra object types for the same basic thing. Now, I was talking to this guy from Microsoft Consulting Services in the States, and he's working on an enormous environment there, 300,000 identities. And they originally went for a portal design where they defined employee, contractor, you know, they defined all these different object classes. The reason they did it is because in the portal, you only have a limited set of forms per object type. You have create, view, and edit, and that's your lot. And they wanted to have different forms for different, you know, contractors and employees. However, it was a mistake. And he is now in there doing a complete redesign of the system, literally from the ground up, because that was such a bad mistake to make. So, yeah, if you're tempted, don't. Binding, I always put validations and friendly descriptions on that. If you're not doing it, it won't mean much. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about this object-oriented thing. The portal, by its very nature, is object-oriented. Everything in the portal is an object. So, you know, when you try and make a change, it makes a request object. If there's an approval spawned for that, there's an approval object. When the person responds, it makes an approval response object. Everything's an object. And then there's sort of reference links between these. And it works better if we, when we're doing our schema modifications, if we follow that general principle. So if you were in my talk yesterday, you would have seen I did this little thing where I let people go and select an application in the portal. And it was just a tick box and a drop-down list, and they were directly bound to the person object. I actually wouldn't do that in a production environment because it's very limiting. I would have an application object type. And then people would go and click and bring up a list of all the applications that were in their, you know, rights to be able to select. And they would essentially be choosing an object type. Okay? That's a far more extensible way to do it. Now, sometimes as well, that's a sort of a two-dimensional relationship. I have a link to an application. Sometimes you actually need a three-dimensional relationship. That link to that application needs some properties as well. And I have a picture here. I apologize, it's not a great picture. It's a screenshot from a thing I did a while back now. But what this is the customer, they're an Office 365 customer, and we're actually setting up the FIM portal as a front end for Office 365 self-service and management. And they wanted to be able to manage mailbox delegations. So I actually created a delegation object. And so this delegation object here, it shows the person, who's then receiving rights to the other person's mailbox, and then we have the roles that you can have. And just the next one, this is the person whose mailbox has been delegated, and they can actually see straight away exactly who's got access to their mailbox and what roles. But this is another object type. So it's always better to think in that object-oriented way when you're working with the portal. So some policy stuff. What was I going to talk about here? Oh yeah, I know. Get back onto the demo. Right, the first thing I wanted to say about MPRs, have a naming convention. Make them easy to find. I always put some kind of three-letter acronym at the front. This one's just CST for custom. Now, the thing that I really want to say, and I take it there aren't that many people working with the FIM portal, so bear with me, but you should separate your access control from your workflow MPRs. So with an MPR, you can both grant accesses in the portal and you can trigger workflows, and some of the out-of-the-box ones definitely have both. So we'll have our requesters, and our requesters will be some set of people, and then we say, what are they allowed to do? And then we potentially tick this grant permission, and then we've got who are they allowed to do it to, and then finally what workflows we want to trigger. Now, I always completely separate grants permission from workflow. And there's a couple of reasons. Now, first, it makes my workflow MPRs really simple. So you will have seen with that one that the requester was all people. And pretty much all my workflow triggering MPRs are based, if they're a request one, then it's a request made by all people, or they're a set transition MPR, which is essentially the same thing. It's this notion of we don't care how the object got into this state, but it did, so now we'll trigger these workflows and respond to it in such and such a way. And the thing here is that it's my grants permission MPRs which have all the complexity about who can do what to whom and under which circumstances, right? So I can have as many grants permission MPRs as I want. That's where all the complexity is. And then my workflow MPRs are nice and simple. Someone made this request, therefore I do that. And I know that only people who have the rights could have made the request in the first place because I've got all my grants access MPRs separately. This is important for another reason. There is a problem that happens when two workflows try and update the same attribute at the same time. And if you have a whole lot of MPRs applying to that one request because the requester fell into a couple of sets at the same time and different MPRs applied, and potentially they are actually trying to run the same workflow at the same time, and you actually get a failure. It's this SQL insert, cannot insert duplicate key failure. And it doesn't retry, it just fails. So it can be hard to pick up that that's happened. So keep those MPRs completely separate, and that will be a lot simpler. The other thing, and I'll just go into this one, generate attributes for new people. I like to keep my workflows very small, doing like a single task if possible. So I think when a lot of people start, they say, okay, I want to generate attributes for a new person created in the portal. Right, so I do this great long workflow that does an account name and a display name and a this and a that, and you do this great long multi-step workflow. So I've stopped doing that, and I do these little discrete workflows that just do one thing. And firstly, I can see straight away what this MPR is doing. This doesn't just say generate attributes for new user and then I've got to go into it and look at it. I can see straight away what's happening here. These are more reusable. When someone's name changes, I just reuse this set display name workflow. And again, it's minimizing that risk of two workflows trying to update the same attribute at the same time. Now, another thing I do to try and simplify things for myself is I've extended the schema of the workflow definition and the set definition objects, and I've, yeah?
Sorry, just a question. When you're breaking it down into those much smaller steps, do you end up with problems around scheduling and making sure that the linearity...
Okay, so yeah, so this is the reason you would have multiple steps in one workflow, because you have to have them run in that order. So obviously if they have to run in that order, then you do need to put multiple steps in the workflow activity. There is another trick I've used a few times, and that's actually sometimes to run actions in the authorization phase. So you've got your authentication phase, your authorization phase, and your action phase. And data is committed to the database in between the authorization and the action phase, right? So, however, you can actually sneak some actions in that authorization phase if you really need that to kind of run first, and then the actions, other things to actually run later. And the example is when I'm doing things with like PowerShell, where it's an external thing. And so I need to go off and run this external process, set up the mailbox delegation, and I want to get a response back from PowerShell saying it succeeded before I commit the value that it succeeded to the portal database. And I actually run those things in the authorization phase. And in a way, you're saying, well, this PowerShell script is authorizing that I can actually write this data to the database because it did actually succeed. So yeah, obviously if order is significant, then yeah, you have to either put them all in one workflow activity or do things, these sort of phase tricks. But quite often I find it's just little things, set display name, that I'm doing more often than not. Okay, so I just want to quickly show you, again, this is a script available on the FIM team script site. I have a little process that actually writes all the MPRs using the workflow into this field, and I do the same thing for sets. So the administrator one has a lot of MPRs that use it. Again, it's just that it just helps a lot from administration, and when you're trying to trace through, which MPRs are calling which workflows and that sort of thing. Right, was I going to say anything else here? I don't think so. Okay, I've noticed quite a few talks I've been into, everyone's been saying, if you're not using PowerShell, start using PowerShell. So if you're not using PowerShell, start using PowerShell. You cannot do the FIM portal without PowerShell. The FIM portal is a little bit restricted on bulk operations. And so if you need to do, bulk inserts of a whole heap of people at once or bulk updates, then PowerShell is the way to go. PowerShell R2, the R2 for FIM R2, the PowerShell snap-in for FIM R2 now handles dates, which was so annoying before that you couldn't write a date attribute. Now, if you're on R1 and you've got the portal, you can install the R2 PowerShell snap-in on a workstation and use it from there, and it will insert the dates quite happily. The fault was actually in the PowerShell snap-in, not in the FIM servers. There is a function library. I've put the link there. I use that all the time to make my scripts a lot simpler. You just insert, call the function library at the top, and then things like updating values and updating multi-values, there's nice little functions for that. I've got a couple of resources there. So there's that link to the FIM team community site and TechNet Wiki script box and my blog. Now, I did want to tell you about this because this is neat. So Craig Martin is the PowerShell FIM MVP. He's really obsessed with PowerShell. And he wrote a really nice little workflow activity that will run a PowerShell script as part of a FIM portal workflow. Now, I'd written one of these myself as well, but his is better. And it's free, and you can just get the ready compiled DLL off CodePlex and just stick it in your GAC and you're good to go. Okay? And he's even got a script that'll help you install it. Now, the great thing he did is he actually takes the request object and he sends it through to the PowerShell script. And the request object has all the great stuff. Who made the request? Who's the target? Exactly what are we trying to change here? Even any workflow data variables that you've defined as part of that workflow are all accessible through the request object. So this is awesome. I love this. And you know what? This actually, I think, takes away a lot of the need to develop custom action workflows. Because we're supposed to go into Visual Studio and do all this stuff with Windows Workflow Foundation, and if you come from a system background like I do, it's a bit heavy going. Now I can make a PowerShell script. Great. So I'm going to be looking into that a lot more after I finish all this TechNet. And he's got some sample scripts as well there. There's a link. So UI configuration. Oh, I just wanted to include, is anyone doing RCDCs at all? No, this is going to mean nothing to you. Okay. If you are editing RCDCs, these are the forms. These are the pop-up forms in the portal. And there's XML behind, and you have to go in and edit the XML. And if you make any mistakes, it just says error. And it doesn't tell you where the error is, it just says error. There is an RCDC editing tool available from Tools for FIM. I haven't used the most recent version, though I've heard it's pretty good. So you have to buy that tool. Otherwise, I just use an XML-aware editor. Test after each change, recycle the app pool, yeah, whatever. You're not doing those, so you're not going to know. I'm not going to go into these in detail if no one's doing RCDCs. Oh, what this was on, all the text in the forms, you can have all that text. You can either hard code it in the XML or you can put it somewhere else. Now, some of the things like the caption, so where it says photo there, that can come from the schema, and it should come from the schema. And then you can have a description underneath, which can come from the schema as well. But there are other things. There are these hint fields. And then there are those tab headings and various other things with the pop-up boxes, search controls. And these can actually all be controlled in something called string resources. So if you are doing any RCDC stuff, and whenever you find yourself hard-coding text into the XML, just remember that Carol said there's a better way and go look into it, okay? Oh, there's our string resources, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I won't show you all this XML now. I do want to talk about one aspect of RCDC design, and that's selecting things. Now, I said in my talk yesterday, free text is the enemy, and it is, and I'm fighting the good fight against free text. And the best way to do that is with drop-down lists and option lists and pop-up lists and all that sort of thing. Now, most people, when they start doing some RCDC modifications, they pretty quickly realise that there's this thing where you can use the validation string from the schema to make a drop-down list. So this is the out-of-the-box employee type validation string. It will reject any object that doesn't have one of those values in the employee string, the employee type attribute. And you can actually do a pretty simple little control where you say item source, get it from the schema. Now the problem is that validation string is limited to something like 128 characters. You run up against that limit before you even know about it. So then there's another way. You can hard code the options at the top of the RCDC XML. You can define your own XML data source at the top and put all these options in there, and then you basically say binding source sites and looks up the top and it finds where you define the sites. Okay, do we like hard coding? No, hard coding's rubbish. We want to avoid hard coding as much as possible. So again, the answer is to think in an object-oriented way. Define objects for those things you want people to select. Now, the great thing here is we have an unlimited length. We can have as many objects as we want to. We have a choice of controls, and I'm going to show them to you in a second. We can filter in various ways. So I have all these sites, but I can say just show them these ones. I can even base it on their permissions. They don't have rights to see the ones they shouldn't. And then also I can delegate the upkeep of that list. Either I can give someone the right in the portal to go in and keep that list up to date, or better, I can do it through the sync service. So in the case of cost codes, get access to that purchasing system, to that table where those cost codes live, import them in as cost code objects, and that list will magically keep itself up to date, and we like that. So let's have a look at these controls. Right, so the first one I'm going to show you, this one's called a UOC list view, and this is good for when you don't have a lot of options and you just want it to appear like that in the form, but you want to have some columns to give people a bit of extra information. Now, the interesting thing about this control is it's only available for multi-valued attributes, but you can set it to single select mode. So there we go, single select mode, even though it's multi-valued underneath. So that one's quite neat. Next we have the pop-up type. And so this is where you have a lot of options and you need to provide people with a search functionality. So I wonder if we've got Auckland in. No, actually, I don't know if we do. Let's see. No, we don't have Auckland. I know we've got the Gold Coast because I did that for my... There we go. So we can give people a search functionality. The other thing we can do, there's this thing in the portal called search scopes. If you do start working with the portal, I recommend you find out how to use search scopes. They're very, very useful. And so here I can say, just show me the sites in Australia. And I can even just search on the sites in Australia if I want to, within that search scope. Okay, so that's where you have a lot of options, and so you want to be able to give people some help actually finding what they're looking for. So there's a variation on that one, which I've done here on Assistant. It's the same type of control, but I've got a filter in the control. So instead of search scope based, it's filtered. And the filtered one, you see, I don't have any search option, but it gives me the options straight away. I didn't have to look for them. So here I've just said all people whose account name starts with F is my filter. And again, this is probably good when you don't have too many options. You don't want people to have to be paging through this looking for something. The last one I want to show you is very neat, but I have to tell you it's undocumented. And there's a bit of a grey area in FIM with undocumented things. There's stuff that is explicitly unsupported, which you should know not to use. There is other stuff that is undocumented, but people have figured out it works. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the hot fixes break these things. So if you want to use it, I would use it if I was in my own environment internal and I was like managing that environment and I could fix it if it broke. Going out and providing services to a customer, I steer clear of things like this. But it is very neat. Now here, our departments are objects. And for some reason, to get your objects in a nice little drop down like this is undocumented. I don't know why. But, you know, to the user, it looks like it's just a list of things. Now, there's one extra step here, and I'm just going to submit that. Oh, it set that to false because it had no value, so it automatically sets the booleans to false. What I've just saved onto that person is a GUID. It's not actually the department name, it's a link. So that's not very useful for then synchronizing out to Active Directory. So what I have is a little workflow. Every time that's changed, where's the department? There it is. So that's the one I set, and then the workflow ran, and it just copied the display name of the linked object and stuck it in the string field. So it's a very, very simple little workflow, uses the out-of-the-box function evaluator activity, very easy to set up, but it is that little extra step that you've got to do so that you can use these controls. But I would recommend that as a general approach. Okay? Good. We've just enough time to talk about password sync. Password reset, I should say. Oh, yeah, there's a change, but if you're not working with a portal, you're not going to care about that. Okay, so I did just have a couple of slides on self-service password reset because I think a lot of people going in with the FIM portal now will probably have this quite high on their list of things they want to implement. And fortunately, with R2, it's good. With R1, we could only offer self-service password reset to our domain-joined users on their domain-joined computers. And there's so many people today, either with external users or with internal users coming in through untrusted networks, devices, whatever. So what they've done now is we actually have proper portals, and they're separate portals, one for registration for self-service password reset and one to actually reset your password when you forget it. So it is a question and answer based reset. So the person needs to register, answer the questions, they're registered, so the password reset functionality is there when they need it. And I did want to make sure that everyone understands the general architecture. If you have external people, you do not put the password reset portal in the DMZ. It stays internal, and you use a reverse proxy, such as TMG, to get the traffic to and from that portal, okay? So that's the architecture. You do need some kind of reverse proxy if you're offering this to untrusted networks. And like I said before, if I was doing that, I would definitely have it on a standalone server. And I know you can't read the tiny writing there, but FIM1 has got sync and regular portal, and then FIM2 has got registration and reset portals on a separate box. So here's a couple of new features. So we finally have a proper web portal front end, which is great. This is another nice thing that they've given us with R2, pre-registration PowerShell commandlets. So this was something a lot of people were asking for, particularly, say, in university environments where you don't want every single student to have to go and register for password reset. They're not going to do it anyway. So let's pre-register them based on some information we have about them, student number and course code, or whatever we happen to have. We have a new password reset option, which is one-time password gates. So in R1, all we could do was type in a new password. Now we can actually generate a random password for that user and send it to them either via SSMS or to a secondary email address. And the workstation client now actually uses the password reset portal. So with R1, it's actually an ActiveX control that's installed on that workstation, which people didn't really like, and it was quite hard to customize for branding. Now, actually, we're just all using the one portal, so that's greatly simplified. So, a couple of best practices, as that is what we're talking about. The workstation client is, if the workstation client basically adds a link under the Control-Alt-Delete prompt. So it's right there when the person's at their computer and they go, oh, I forgot my password, they can click on the link right there. My understanding is this works better for one person, one computer type environments than environments where people are moving around using a lot of different shared computers. And the reason is that every time someone new logs in, it goes off and checks if they're registered yet, and then pops up and nags them if they're not, okay? So this can cause traffic problems, you know, and performance problems in lab environments, for instance. If you are having a lot of password reset activity, then a dedicated FIM service partition for that is recommended. Now, this is a good one. I emailed my colleagues at Unify for their best practices recommendations as I was putting this deck together. And the number one recommendation for a self-service password reset was do not let a committee choose the questions, because they will take 6 months. And they will argue about all the PC this and that. Try and avoid that if you can. But unfortunately, the next best practice kind of counteracts this a little bit. You do have to get the questions right from the start, because if you change the questions, it forces people to re-register, okay? So we've got a bit of, we want to get the questions right, but we don't want to wait 6 months while people argue about what's PC. So look, there's some great resources out there on the internet now. I put a sample link there, you know, where you can go and just pick up some fairly bland, you know, questions that should do the trick. And I think that's it. Okay. I've got a couple of minutes for questions, but otherwise, look, anyone's welcome to come talk to me afterwards. Yep.